Okay. In that case, we've got a good 9 minutes for questions. So, can I open the floor to questions from you all? Yes.
Can you tell us about the methodology in which you collected these data?
Yeah. So when you say method, do you mean collecting the data or crunching the data?
Collecting the data.
Collecting the data. So we have a fairly arduous process in terms of hiring students, both graduate students and undergraduate students, training them, and I'd say about 20% of the students we train are eventually seen as good enough to actually code the data. Once those students are collecting the data, they collect it from all sorts of sources. They collect it from LexisNexis, they collect it from various other kinds of sources, and we have students who also speak foreign languages, so we can also sometimes collect in those languages. And then we have people whose full-time job it is to check that data and make sure that data is correct and make sure the students are doing their proper job. And only after it's gone through a secondary check do we put that data into the data set. And we develop a code book that is based on our previous experience as well as the fundamental questions we're trying to answer. And we occasionally, depending upon the availability of data or what we're seeing in that data, change the variable nature that we're coding.
So can I have a follow-up question?
Let me add just one other thing, which is part of this data has also been coded using automated methods. So we have worked on a couple of projects where we've worked with computational scientists that help to sift through the very large amounts of text that we discover through the normal search processes and try to direct our coders. In some cases, we've also worked on projects that have directly gone from text to actual numeric coding. We have experience working on both of those. We've decided, though, that the data set that we're working with is reliant primarily or almost exclusively on the hand coding and the coding by students and the editorial process, because computers are good, but they're not that good yet.
I think I'm just wondering, because this data is very sensitive data, right? Like this, where the source is from, where did you get this information from is what I'm looking for, because obviously you can't make a survey to ask what kind of organization do you have? Do you have like what, you know what I mean? So
Actually, you can. There are people who have, and field work can be, talking to next to somebody who's done some, can be very challenging. And this is why I am a huge fan of multi-methodological approaches. So I think it's extraordinarily important to get different approaches for different types of data, from a survey to the kind of data collection we're doing to qualitative, because each of those methodological lenses gives you a different view into what's going on. And yes, it is clear to us that there's things that we're not catching. Our data is not perfect. We strive to make our data as good as we can. But there's some concrete reasons why there are things that survey data is going to catch that we can't, and vice versa.
Yeah, just to elaborate on that some, so there are questions about the reliability of the sources, so we're looking for multiple sources. There are questions about the fact that we rely on media reporting and we rely on online reporting. So when things blow up, people pay attention, and when they're quiet, they don't. And so we have processes where we try to take into account, for instance, in our network data, we know that relationships don't die overnight, and yet if things are not being blown up, they don't get reported on, so we have procedures in place to try to take care of that. But in the end, you're right, these are relationships and activities and structures that don't want to be observed. And so we are constantly trying to be as conservative as we can be about what ends up in the data set, because we know that there are active attempts to try to keep us from knowing some things. Now, the flip side, sometimes there are people that will email us from groups saying, you've got that all wrong. Here's the reality, and we'd really rather that you represented us in this way. So, yeah.
We don't trust those emails.
You got a question over here on the right?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, well, as a student in your class, Professor Asal, in years past, I've been introduced to this project and the coding process. I'm just curious, in the years that you experience like doing this, are there other comparable projects at other universities that you kind of run into in the process of finding this data? Because I'm sure it's being utilized by other institutions as well. And I'm just curious, like, are those comparable projects or?
There are some other comparable data sets at this point. Most of the other data sets are not coding yearly. They're coding high points. There's some projects now that are looking at specific, like ethnic, so Kathleen Cunningham and David Cunningham are doing some work that are looking specifically at ethnic organizations. UCDP, the Upsala data set's great, but it only looks at the high points for each organization. When I mean high points, so we code a size of an organization every year. UCDP codes the biggest size for the entire time period, which could be 20 years. So different data sets are offering you different options, and there's more effort now to do this. But a lot of the extent of the BAD2 data set and the yearly nature of it makes it fairly rare.
I've got a follow-up question, and that is when we're talking about the relationship of violent extremism and trafficking, and then we're talking about doing research on that, but what about parallels? And what about taking the analogy? And do you see any prospect for taking some of the approaches that you've used for studying political violence to studying the phenomenon of human trafficking?
Absolutely. So we're currently working on a project that is in conjunction with the University of Maryland, where the teams together are looking at violent organizations, political violent organizations, but also looking at criminal organizations.
Okay.
And so you could certainly and would explore the possibility of collecting data on criminal organizations and violent organizations related to human trafficking. I will note that criminal organizations are even harder to collect data on than violent organizations, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. And we've been able to collect data for this this project that we're doing with the University of Maryland.
We also have a project with the University of Sydney that looks at piracy. So maritime piracy, collecting data on maritime pirates. Actually, our collaborators at the University of Sydney actually have a network of informants in the Horn of Africa that have gone and interviewed pirates. I'm glad I'm not doing that field work. So.